Welcome aboard the Pink Monorail podcast. My name is Noah. I am normally the host of the Street Rider podcast, where I talk about arcade games and fighting games. I'm also a huge Disney fan, and that is why I am appearing on here. The usual hosts for the Pink Monorail are Shelly and Alice. They are recording new episodes while I'm filling in for the series on Disney in China. Today, we're going to look at the rest of Shanghai Disneyland and how the Disney company finished this ambitious project. Adventure Isle was not the only new land planned for Shanghai. There would be an entire land built around the mythos of Pirates of the Caribbean. The exact name of this place was Treasure Cove, and it celebrated the era created by the films and original Disneyland attraction. This land was supposed to represent a small Caribbean port that had been taken over by Captain Jack Sparrow and his crew. There was a small lake in front of the land with a sandy beach, known as Shipwreck Shore. There were pirate ships docked on the shore, and a few halfway sunk in the harbor. The enormous building that framed the edge of the land was shaped like an old Spanish fort. This building was lovingly called Fort Snobbish. It had been abandoned and taken over by pirates. This would become the show building for the Pirates of the Caribbean: Battle for the Sunken Treasure. Caribbean opened at Disneyland in 1967. It was considered the gold standard for dark rides. How impressive was its legacy? To this day, it was still considered one of the best dark rides ever created. In the 60s, audiences had only the faintest idea of what was in store for them as Walt Disney would tease the progress of the attractions on his television show. When it actually opened, the guests could not get enough of this ride. No attraction before had put so much effort into immersing a rider into a completely new world. It was deceptive, as it was hidden inside a French colony-style mansion in New Orleans Square. The ride was filled with actual physical props, skeletons, weapons, and life-size animatronics. It also had a catchy song and groundbreaking effects to tie the whole theme together. It was such a popular attraction that audiences were clamoring for their own version in Florida, much to the chagrin of Mark Davis, the Imagineer and one of the designers on the original attraction. Visitors to Walt Disney World and shareholders demanded their own pirates. This meant that his planned Western River expedition would have to be scrapped. Davis invested his time in helping make the queue more distinct in the Walt Disney World version, if at the cost of having a weaker ride itself. Even then, both versions of the attractions set a standard and made it so that every future variation of the Magic Kingdom had to have it, with the exception of Hong Kong Disneyland. Several things made the attraction unique, not the least of which were that guests were completely surrounded by actual models and props of treasures, skeletons, and ships. This was well before the era of 4D attractions, where guests wore 3D glasses and stared at projections of objects. There was something to be said about riding in, around, and through physical objects. When guests were taken past a pirate ship assaulting a Spanish fort, they could feel the cannon blast overhead and see the explosions hit the water all around them. They were watching life-size animatronic pirates interrogating a governor, chasing women, or selling wenches in the market. These scenes were presented with an air of politically incorrect humor. Nonetheless, they gave the experience a certain sense of authenticity. When guests were taken through a burning village, they felt as if it could collapse at any moment. No detail was overlooked in the planning of this attraction. When it came to Shanghai, the attraction would get a completely new makeover. With that, it would also feature a new story. The original ride did not have a narrative per se, but instead it was a collection of images and scenes, sort of like a dream made up of similar but not necessarily interconnected ideas. The same thing could be said of the Haunted Mansion. There was not a specific story to the attraction, but instead a bunch of images that audiences were allowed to interpret. All of that changed in 2003 for Pirates with the release of the first film, The Curse of the Black Pearl. From that point on, audiences came to expect some sort of connection between the films and rides. Over the years, Disney began introducing effects and animatronics from the different film characters, such as Jack Sparrow, Davy Jones, Blackbeard, and Captain Barbossa, right into the attraction. Chinese audiences were familiar with the film series, and Disney would not have to teach them about the mythology behind the Pirates universe. Shanghai Disneyland would receive an attraction that was rooted somewhere in between the continuity of Dead Man's Chest and At World's End. We know the ride takes place during this time because the villain Davy Jones was still alive. In the new attraction, Jack and his crew would be chasing a legendary treasure. Guests would be taken on a journey that had never been done in any park. Aside from the plans for a new queue, which was arguably superior to those in Florida and Paris, the ride itself would feature a number of firsts while still managing to incorporate effects that Disney had created more than 60 years ago. The boats themselves would still float along a predetermined path. This was a deep flume that was invisible to passengers. What was different in this version was how the boat would be propelled. In the original attraction, the Imagineers hid rubber bumpers just under the surface of the water to keep the boats from running off course. Guests could very often feel the bumpers as the boats hit the edges on each turn. The boats were propelled along the track by underwater jets, similar to a jacuzzi tub hidden inside the flume. The downside to this was that some of the jets would break down and the boats would move along slower and slower. Over time, with few operational jets left, the boats slowed to a crawl and began creating gridlock in the middle of the attraction. Boats would bump into each other, jarring the passengers. The only way to fix this was to drain the attraction and refurbish it, which the company did every few years. The new boats in Shanghai would actually feature a magnetic propulsion system controlled by a computer. This allowed the boats to run at a consistent pace. This translated to a much smoother ride and prevented any sort of gridlock, as each boat could be controlled independently. It also meant that the flume could be hidden without the use of bumpers and create a seamless visual experience for guests. This meant that the company would not have to drain the attraction and perform maintenance as often. Most important, the new boats would be able to drift or move almost sideways or backwards around the sets, something that no water-based attraction had ever offered before. Disney would still build actual sets for the ride, accent them with projection screens, and put visitors in the middle of the action. There would be no need for 3D glasses at the climax of this attraction because visitors would actually travel between an actual Black Pearl and the Flying Dutchman as they fired shots right at each other. It was far more impressive a sight than the smaller Wicked Wench galley featured in the original attraction. Moreover, off in the distance, there would be other pirate ships doing battle in a raging storm. Disney would be using projection and projection mapping technology to help bring these seemingly impossible battles to life. The Imagineers would also be featuring the latest generation of animatronics, full-size figures that moved smoothly and could operate seamlessly year after year. What made the ones planned for Shanghai unique were that they were not human characters at all. Instead, the sea creature-like crew of the Flying Dutchman would get up and personal with the riders. One of the first shown to audiences was Macus. This was the first mate on the Flying Dutchman. He had a head shaped like a hammerhead shark. This character was a great swordsman and fiercely loyal to Davy Jones. Many of the creature designs for the film series were created by the award-winning Mark Crash McCreary. His work was sometimes grotesque but also quite memorable. These monsters from the film translated beautifully into the attraction. Imagineers did not work from the CGI models built for the movie. Those were locked on some Industrial Light and Magic computer in Northern California. Instead, they took the design notes and art and recreated the figures using their own 3D tools. This was different than the techniques used by the original artist. People like Blaine Gibson sculpted maquettes as well as full-size figures to make casts from. Using new computer technology, the artist in Imagineering would be able to figure out how to break apart and assemble the different components of a figure and how that figure would fit over a robotic frame. This could be done much faster than sculpting a full-size model and then figuring out how to cut it apart. Despite the different technology, this work still relied on the eye and imagination of a sculptor. The early build of Macus was insanely detailed, down to the tattered uniform, leather straps, and tiny barnacles that covered his hide. Once the animatronic was installed in Shanghai, and the finishing touches were applied by the art team, then the figure would be indistinguishable from his real-life counterpart. This would not be the only character that awaited guests in Shanghai, but he certainly would leave a major impression on the guest. Something that the Disney company failed to grasp during the design and development of Battle for the Sunken Treasure were how close these new theme park experiences were to modern arcade titles. The game series Dead Storm Pirates by Bandai Namco was heavily influenced by the Pirates of the Caribbean films. In the game, guests were able to both pilot a ship and shoot at enemies with a machine gun-like blunderbuss. The deluxe versions of the arcade cabinet even featured a 3D screen and moving seats. In the game, players could battle against ghosts ghosts, zombies, and cursed ships. They could also travel to mysterious islands, explore hidden temples, and fight against wild animals and giant monsters, including the Kraken. The game itself was very fun, and even featured a scene that was not unlike the highlight of the new Pirates attraction. There was a shootout between two pirate ships that players navigated between. Unlike the attraction, the audiences could actually steer their boat and shoot back. It was a high-paced spectacle that even the Buzz Lightyear Astro Blaster attractions would be hard to match. I could not stress enough the importance that a solid game strategy could have on winning audiences over in China. Thankfully, Bandai Namco would be building the new Star Wars Battle Pod arcade games. Hopefully, they would be partnering with Disney on many more arcade projects and feature those in Shanghai, but I digress. Treasure Cove would try and keep a consistent theme inside and outside the show buildings. Similar to Adventure Isle, there was a play area set aside for youngsters. The Siren's Revenge was a wrecked French galleon. It was also a 3-story interactive play area. The play areas had been popular in every other park Disney had built, and this new area would undoubtedly be competing against Camp Discovery for some industry awards. This area of Disneyland would also be the home of the Explorer canoes. In the original Disneyland, the canoes circled the rivers of America and originated from Tom Sawyer Island. This time around, the canoes would circle Shipwreck Shore, pass by the Siren's Revenge, and bring guests close to Adventure Isle. This land also featured a large theater named El Teatro Fandango. Inside would be a live-action stunt show, the first of its kind, as this show was called The Eye of the Storm, Captain Jack's Stunt Spectacular. It was the first Western-style stunt show planned for the park, and quite possibly the first Western-style stunt show in all of China. It was a sort of counterpoint to the Tarzan show in Adventure Isle. This new show would feature exciting battles between Jack Sparrow, the crew from the Flying Dutchman, as well as the soldiers assigned to protect the East India Trading Company. There were dramatic sword battles, giant stage props for the characters to swing across, climb over, and fall from. There were even explosive special effects that would place the audience in the middle of a virtual monsoon. Treasure Cove was shaping up to be one of the most desirable visitation spots in all of the lands. It had rock-solid theming, as well as a known franchise tie-in, and enough sights for guests to take in and fill up their entire day with. But that was not the only thing the park had to offer. In the next stop, we're going to take a look at the heart of the park, the land designed for families to experience together. Shanghai Disneyland was unique in that many of the lands were completely changed to suit the tastes of a nation. Previously, in Hong Kong, Paris, or Tokyo, some lands were renamed or moved to different areas of the park, but they often had a counterpart in the original Magic Kingdom or Disneyland. As we saw in previous stops on our tour of Shanghai, there were completely new lands and completely new landmarks for guests to discover. The hub itself had even become a destination known as the Gardens of Imagination. This area of the park sat right in front of the enchanted storybook castle and in a way was a counterpart to Fantasyland. In Shanghai, Fantasyland sat just behind the castle. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean in Anaheim, Fantasyland was the heart of the original Disneyland. It held the greatest concentration of attractions themed after the Walt Disney animated features. It was a destination for children of all ages and could be best experienced as a family. The new Fantasyland would actually be the largest of the themed lands in Shanghai and bring with it many of the attractions from both Disneyland and the Magic Kingdom. The entire park, of course, was designed with families in mind. However, the central area of the park, from Mickey Avenue all the way through the castle and into Fantasyland, would have shops and restaurants to accommodate a large volume of daily visitors. Young princesses could get made up in the Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique, and after that, families could choose from several dining locations. The Royal Banquet Hall was located inside the castle itself, and actually had rooms themed after Aurora, Cinderella, Tiana, Mulan, and Snow White. Outside the castle, there was the Italian restaurant, Pinocchio's Country Kitchen. There was also the Tangled Tree Tavern, a restaurant modeled after the Snuggly Duckling pub from the film Tangled. But of course, guests did not visit Fantasyland for just shopping and good food. There was a matter of a boat ride under the castle, the voyage to the Crystal Grotto, where guests would be treated to scenes from different movies such as Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Fantasia, Mulan, and Tangled. It would be a combination of animatronics, projections, and effects that had not been seen in any other Disney park. Outside of the castle, there were some unique attractions. In keeping with the themes from the Gardens of Imagination, there was a hedge maze, modeled after the one from Alice in Wonderland, but the Queen of Hearts would not necessarily challenge anyone to a game of croquet. There would be statues celebrating the film characters, of course. There were also some beloved dark rides that would be building an entirely new fan base in China. Peter Pan's Flight was expected to bring all of the new effects that the Imagineers had created for the refurbished Disneyland original, with perhaps an extra touch or two. There would also be an entirely new attraction called the Honey Pot Spin. It would be replacing the classic Teacups attraction. This new ride would feature the characters and themes from the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Shanghai would receive a wonderful mix of the classic and modern attractions that made Disneyland so memorable. Of course, some of the kids that visited Fantasyland were a little older and wanted rides with some thrill. For those guests, Disney would be bringing over the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train coaster from the USA. It had debuted to rave reviews at Walt Disney World during the Fantasyland expansion. This attraction would bring along with it all of the amazing animatronics and visual effects that the hybrid dark ride / coaster had won praise for. I was eager to see how Chinese guests would react to this unique coaster. Disney could guarantee that no park in China had anything even remotely close. With everything announced for Shanghai Disneyland during the D23 convention in 2015, but nothing shown as far as complete attractions, fans were left with many questions. Why was this project taking so much time to build? Would it be ready for opening day? After all, Disney CEO Bob Iger celebrated the groundbreaking on April 8, 2011, and the park was supposed to open at the end of 2015. However, that date and having Iger step down as CEO had been pushed back. In 2014, Iger even announced that the company had invested an extra $800 million on new rides, bringing the total investment to the park to over $5.5 billion. Many industry insiders said that there was no way that the Shanghai park would be completed on opening day, that instead the company would have a rolling opening over 2016 and unveil new lands as they were finished from month to month. The core of the park, Mickey Avenue, the Gardens of Imagination, and Fantasyland were expected to be open right away. It would be the rest of the lands that had to catch up. So what happened in that time, and why was the Disney company seemingly behind schedule? The answer had a lot to do with making sure that the park was completed correctly. It had to meet and exceed the expectations of the Chinese guests, as well as international visitors that would be traveling to the park. This was an expensive resort, and the Disney company could not afford to have it be a gamble. Something that had hurt the Disney resorts in the past came down to the decisions made by management and the people that they put in charge of operations. The biggest mistake that the company made was assuming that everyone around the world was clamoring for their own Disneyland. Build it and they will come. That was a saying coined in the term Field of Dreams. Unfortunately, that saying only worked in the movie. Former Disney CEO Michael Eisner's plans for a Euro Disneyland fell flat in the eyes of investors and many guests. The Guardian reminded readers that the park hadn't really turned a profit since it opened and was asking for another bailout in 2014. There were many reasons why the park was considered a stain on Disney's ledger. It was a beautiful park with many great rides and attractions, but there were many things the company did not plan on. The location was a major problem. It was in Marne-la-Vallée, almost 20 miles from Paris and in the middle of nowhere. Locals were considered apathetic towards the park, and cast members considered it a job out of desperation. There were stories that made their way on web forums over the past 20 years about how rude Europeans were at Disneyland Paris and its sister Walt Disney Studios Park. Guests had no concept of the queue and would push and shove their way to the front of the line. Smoking was prohibited in most of the park, but people smoked openly everywhere and would put their cigarettes out on guests in the queue to get them to move out of the way. Cast members didn't seem focused on enforcing the rules and let kids climb all over the property and let guests hop fences and set up picnics wherever they pleased. Some of these things were due to cultural differences between the USA and Europe. Many public parks were open and guests were invited to camp wherever they pleased. With that said, however, even Parisians were becoming aware of how they were perceived by the rest of the world. The Paris Metro began an ad campaign in 2012 asking their riders not to be rude and to be more considerate of other passengers. To be fair though, some French social conventions were misinterpreted by US tourists. For example, slow table service at a restaurant. In Paris, people enjoy taking their time during a meal, perhaps order a few courses and wait for their friends as well. The waiter shows their respect by giving the guest maximum table time. In the US and other countries, people expect for a server to be prompt and constantly ask if there's anything else they could get for them. Of course, there were also issues with park upkeep. Since it was losing money, the investors saw little reason why they should pay extra for continuous maintenance. This created a vicious cycle of more things breaking down, which meant more people would stay away from the park altogether. These were not all exclusively problems with Paris Disneyland. The same cycle of upkeep and lack of planning was hurting the parks in Florida and California. Earlier in the series, we talked about how much money the Disney California Adventure was costing the company and what they had to do to make it profitable. The year-after-year losses were happening in Hong Kong as well. Again, we talked about what the Disney company had to do to turn that park around and make it profitable. The original Michael Eisner strategy failed in Paris and it failed in Hong Kong as well. Building the parks was not enough to ensure attendance. The Disney company did not want to make it 3 for 3 with Shanghai. The design of the park had to be redone as Disney discovered how unique the tastes were of the Chinese, especially how they varied from region to region. A one Magic Kingdom fits all approach would not work in Shanghai. The people from the mainland expected a true Chinese Disneyland, not another off-the-shelf Disneyland in China. In the next stop, we will explore the reasons why Shanghai Disneyland was a long time coming and how the company planned to get everything back on track. The Disney company needed to ensure that Shanghai was going to be a successful venture. As such, they invested more in the development of this park than any other park in the world. They also had invested heavily in the companies that would be running the resort along with the government. It was a similar setup to Hong Kong International Theme Parks Limited, the organization that ran Hong Kong Disneyland. There was an important difference, however. This time around, Disney would be the majority shareholder in the Shanghai International Theme Park Company Limited and the Shanghai International Theme Park and Resort Management Company Limited. Disney would get to put in place the people that they elected to lead the resort, plan its direction, and run the day-to-day operations. It had been years of building Guangxi, the trusted network of partners that could accomplish these goals. Disney had actually been in negotiations with the Chinese government for 20 years before they broke ground in Shanghai. There were untold millions that had been invested in these partnerships over the decades. The Disney company had worked hard to become ingrained in the hearts of the Chinese people. In Hong Kong and Shanghai, they continuously donated time and money to local schools, hospitals, and charity groups. There were even the English language schools that Disney ran in several major Chinese cities. The next generation of Disney fans would become familiar with the mascots thanks to these immersion programs. The company was committed to volunteer efforts and other ways of giving back. They wanted the residents of Hong Kong and Shanghai to see the parks and stores not only as a job for locals, but also as a productive member of the community. The money spent in China was reinvested in China. It was a rare time that a Western company would get to call the shots in China. That was just the start of the Bob Iger era and his big plan for Shanghai. The park needed to be done correctly and not just quickly. Unfortunately, since its groundbreaking in 2011, construction was starting to fall behind schedule. The person that would get Shanghai back on track was an Imagineer with plenty of experience in turning things around. Bob Weiss was the executive vice president at Walt Disney Imagineering. Previously, he was a producer at DreamWorks and president of Bob Weiss Design Island Associates Incorporated. To say that he knew how to get things done was an understatement. Bob had introduced the details of Shanghai Disneyland at the 2015 D23 Expo in Anaheim. It was quite possible that the majority of the attendees had no idea how important he was to the project and why he had been brought on board in the first place. There was actually a good Chinese proverb that described his position in the company. Yuanjun Yi Jie, Ye Jiang Nan Yu. It's easy to find 1,000 soldiers, but hard to find a good general. Thankfully, Bob Iger had found his general and would not likely repeat the mistakes of his predecessor. The Disney company had actually done a lot of reorganizing in the time since Michael Eisner had stepped down. Some wings of the company were consolidated, others were closed down completely. People that had been responsible for the sorry state of the theme parks either stepped down or were moved to other areas of the company where they could be of better use. Some people had smaller roles in management, and executive branches were given a chance to step up and try running different areas of the company. All of these changes took years to happen. During that time, ground had been broken in Shanghai. The company suddenly found itself having to play catch up and make sure that the planning had not gone to waste. Preliminary construction was going to prepare the land for a theme park and make sure that the logistics of the roads and rail systems were worked out with the aid of the government. There were, however, many more challenges for the designers, some of which did not become apparent until after they started working in China. Just off-site the Shanghai property, Disney had actually set aside some land where the developers could test material and paint that would be used in the actual construction of the park. This way, they could see how the new show buildings stood up in the Shanghai weather for months and even years on end. The weather contributed greatly to the planning of this park, but so too did pollution. Pollution could settle on the roofs and walls of buildings, and under the right conditions, it could layer quickly. When this was combined with moisture from the air or even from cleaning crews, it created a chemical solvent. Acid rain, in other words. Paint, tiles, plaster, and cement were fading much faster in Shanghai than in any other part of the world. Shanghai had issues with air quality, and while it was not as bad as Beijing, there were still days where respiratory and even heart conditions could be aggravated by the air itself. Disney could not afford to have guests stay away in droves because of the pollution, nor could they afford to increase the maintenance schedule because the pollution was decaying the park. The Shanghai Shendi Group would work with the government to try and find a long-term solution for this. In the summer of 2015, the government announced that they would be closing down over 150 heavy polluters in Shanghai. These factories were on their way out, and the decision to shut them down ahead of schedule would certainly improve the air quality and maintenance issues at Disneyland. The materials used at the park were not the only thing slowing down construction. In many areas of the park, the ground had to be prepared to accommodate several layers of infrastructure. The bigger the property, the more power it consumed. Utilities on a massive scale had to be again planned out and executed with the help of the government. There would be attractions and show buildings meant to take the abuse of millions of guests and non-stop yearly operation. These would have to be placed atop a solid foundation. These things had to be done correctly the first time. Tearing down and rebuilding a mistake a few years down the road was out of the question. Then there were the issues with trash, power, heating and cooling. How park operations could move in the backlot without interrupting the guest experience had to be planned. Every safety, retail, or logistical path had to be planned out. These things influenced the final shape of the park almost as much as the taste of the audience. Weiss and his team had to make sure that every component was correct so that they could move forward and not waste time fixing older decisions. Bad planning had cost the company billions in Paris, Hong Kong, and Anaheim. There was a different Chinese proverb that summed up the true cost of mistakes. Xiaodong, bu bu, dadong, shi qiu. A small hole not mended in time will become a big hole, much more difficult to mend. Fixes to both DCA and Hong Kong Disneyland were costly and time-consuming, but in the end, both parks were able to become profitable. Bob Iger and his team had managed to turn around two parks that had been planned during the Eisner era. Paris would be an entirely different beast, and not one that could easily be fixed, but dissecting the resort and its issues would be a topic for another day. Upkeep was a top priority for Walt Disney himself. He wanted clean streets, shops, and attractions. Maintenance crews would work overnight to ensure the next day the park looked spotless. A fresh coat of paint was applied wherever there was fading. Bulbs were replaced before they were burnt out. Track and car maintenance on attractions meant that things were replaced before they broke. This cost the business a lot of money, but it also meant the park was able to operate continuously year-round. Moreover, it could do so safely. When maintenance stopped becoming routine around the Eisner era, the visitors took notice. Not only that, but accidents, injuries, and even death were the results of poor maintenance. When Disneyland first opened, it began to change the public's perception on theme parks. Visitors understood that Walt Disney had built a place that had nothing to do with the seedy carnivals and midways that were popular in the first half of the 20th century. The mainland Chinese were not necessarily obsessed with these details, but they did appreciate a high-quality experience. The Chinese tourists certainly wanted to make sure that they received the best park for their money. The people of China would actually be getting a lot more than they expected. Many of these things were not necessarily seen. The Imagineers were not just responsible for planning restaurants, hotels, and attractions, they also had to be aware of any engineering challenges they were up against. In addition to dealing with pollution, they had to make sure that each and every building was up to code, not simply for building inspectors, but for the safety of guests. China did not have a lengthy history with earthquakes, not when compared to a state like California. However, each time there was an earthquake, roads were destroyed and buildings fell rapidly. The construction boom that China had experienced over the past 2 generations meant that some structures were built quickly, cheaply, and without taking natural disasters into consideration. Shanghai Disneyland would be on the northern end of the monsoon belt. There was the challenge of dealing with excess rain, runoff, and oversaturation. These could cause structural problems with larger buildings. There was also the less likely probability that there would be an earthquake in the area. What the planners did not want were guests to be trapped inside of the attractions or show buildings. Disneyland would be built as fast as safety allowed. This was very unlike the hastily built ghost cities that kept the construction bubble inflated in the mainland. The entire infrastructure had to be able to hold up under the stress of natural disasters as much as it had to hold up under high traffic. If I were in China and an earthquake struck, there would be no place I would rather be than at Shanghai Disneyland. There was no way that the enchanted storybook castle would fall, nor any of the other show buildings. They were being built with all of the knowledge that the engineers had learned from California earthquake planning and Florida hurricane tolerances. There was still a budget to consider and of course a deadline that had to be met. Mr. Weiss knew better than to overdevelop the property. There were still vast areas of natural beauty surrounding the property that he did not change. However, the patches of land to the right and left of the entrance still fell behind the berm. In 10 years or so, if the company wanted to, they had enough room to build an entirely new land. It might be themed to Marvel, Pixar, Star Wars, Avatar, or an entirely new property. There was also room on the park property to build a third hotel if demand peaked. Mr. Weiss and his team would ensure that another popular proverb, Yuan De, Yi Ren, Xin Bai Jiao Bu Jiang Li, catch one's heart, never be apart, would come true. With a solid foundation in place, the Imagineers could focus on what was important. They would be able to tell a story. They would be able to make a personal connection with each and every visitor. Disney may have been the new player on the block, however, they were fast becoming the destination for millions of Chinese. Management did what they could do to make sure that the company was always presented in a positive light. This extended beyond charity efforts. The company had spent nearly $6 billion on developing Shanghai Disneyland, yet they did not want to pass that cost along to consumers with high ticket prices. When it opened, it would have one of the lowest, if not the lowest ticket prices of any park they had built in the modern era. Some analysts had estimated the opening ticket price to be around $58. It would be less expensive to visit than even Hong Kong Disneyland. Part of the reason for doing this had to do with public perception. Many Chinese were afraid that Disney would be catering exclusively to the middle class and upper middle class families. The biggest breaks were going to the rich, and the West was giving them another perk. The poor, moderate, and low-income families would not be able to enjoy the park. A 2012 survey from Peking University revealed that the average household income was $2,100. In Shanghai, it was $4,700. In rural areas, it could be as low as $1,600. However, according to a 2015 report by the National Bureau of Statistics, the country continued to push wages up, and the income growth rate was over 8% in 2014. In rural areas, disposable income had grown almost 9%. As the trend continued, especially over the next decade, even the lowest income families would be able to afford to visit Shanghai Disneyland. That was not to say that the best experiences could not be had by wealthy visitors. Aside from the pricey themed rooms at the Shanghai Disneyland Hotel, an exclusive Club 33 in the park was also built. From every angle, the Disney company was poised for greatness in China. The next stop for the Pink Monorail will be a summary on the series. There was no doubt that China was an economic superpower. The long-term financial health of the Disney company would rely greatly on getting the nation to buy into the brand. There were many challenges that Disney had to overcome before building the parks on the mainland. They had to find the right partners with which to do business with. They had to learn the business culture, social traditions, laws, and customs of the regions that they worked in between. The company was in the business of entertainment. They had been the most successful at doing that for almost a century. Disney accomplished this because they held storytellers to a higher standard. Would the Imagineers from the West be able to connect with the audiences from the East? This nation would be a great challenge to work in. Perception from and of the Chinese people was something yet to be considered. The country demanded respect from the world. Chinese nationals tried to show that the population had become more sophisticated by outspending the other nations. Consumption had grown by leaps and bounds, especially on high-end fashion products and expensive goods. Yet all of the demonstrations of newfound wealth would fall on deaf ears. China was still known for producing most of the counterfeit goods in the world. Even if a person flaunted their wealth, the stigma remained. If critics took a closer look at the label, would it be the genuine article? The country, and not solely a select few, did not seem to mind a blatant disregard for intellectual property. Despite changing some colors and putting square holes in the ears, many noticed the eerie similarities between Mickey Mouse and certain mouse statues that appeared in Beijing during the Olympics. The mouse statues were sponsored by the Beijing Financial District. The sponsors noted that 2008 was the year of the rat, according to the Chinese zodiac, and it was a simple coincidence. Of course, a statue of a rat could have been created with an infinite number of styles and aesthetics. The shape of the head, gloved hands, shorts, and oversized shoes on the Beijing Park statue seemed more deliberate. Few could argue that some unscrupulous people were exploiting the Disney image when fake mascots began posing with crowds and demanding money. It would be easy for any person to buy an unlicensed Mickey or Minnie costume, usually made in China as well, and pull the same scam at any major city. The problem was not limited to China. Pin collectors in the US had been burned by Chinese counterfeits as well. It was not known what steps Disney had planned in order to protect customers in their parks from these scammers. Chinese officials and businesses had become aware that the reputation of the nation had been tarnished by counterfeit goods. With Disney setting up operations overseas, it made sense that the authorities would begin cracking down on pirates and vendors of unlicensed items. IP enforcement had improved in China over the past few years. Many in the international community were hoping that the trend continued. The biggest challenge would be for social change. The nation struggled for most of the 20th century. They relied on outsourced job contracts to help build the economy. During this time, they learned to tighten their belt, were asked by the government to limit the size of their family to one child, and work for the collective good. They learned to be frugal with their money and seek out the best deals they could possibly get. They did not do this for the sake of being cheap, but rather for the sake of survival. When things improved financially, they did not lose their bargain hunting perspective. There had been stories of millionaires all around the world that lived on a very small budget. These money hoarders could remember going to sleep hungry. They could remember being cold in the winter, and they could remember how hard life was before they had money. They never lost their ability to conserve, even when they had excess. The Chinese in major cities had been used to getting great deals on goods, both the real and counterfeit kind, for generations. Conspicuous consumption was for the sake of pride, but spending money on family was a matter of principle. Would an entire populace suddenly begin turning down offers too good to be true for electronics and other merchandise? What about younger generations that were used to being able to have their gaming consoles do far more than those sold in the West? Why should they give up hundreds of pre-installed games on their platform just because Sony or Microsoft said they didn't pay for them? Did the nation not produce all of the gaming consoles and print all the games to begin with? China was a massive country, and like the other nations on Earth, it did not have one single identity or way of thinking. China was made up of multiple ethnic groups, each with their own language, history, and culture. It did not make them a nation of thieves just because they did not readily pay a considerable markup on goods and services as the rest of the world did. Their country had existed for thousands of years, and their culture could not be shamed by the West. The Disney Company was in a unique position. For the first time in history, they had gone into a country where the population was not falling over themselves for some of the Disney magic. They had to convince the people of China that the Disney experience could not be paralleled. No park that had already set up shop in China or any of the dozens scheduled to be built over the next 20 years could match them. The Disney brand relied on storytelling. Guests that visited the parks took center stage. The employees in the resorts went out of their way to make sure each visitor felt like a star. The brand went much deeper than exceptional customer service. There was a first-class quality that all the resorts had. It was something that Walt had set the standard on. It was something that Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, Wing Ting Chow, Tom Staggs, Craig Russell, John Lasseter, Bob Iger, Bob Weiss, and all of the other executives aspired to recreate. Disneyland was a special place. When Walt Disney wanted visitors to be able to ride a bobsled inside of a mountain 365 days a year, he tasked his Imagineers to turn a pile of dirt into the Matterhorn and put a coaster inside of it. The company did not try to cheat guests with the experience. They did not decorate a warehouse to look like a mountain. They did not put 3D glasses on visitors and have them go in circles. Those experiences could be found at any other park. When Disney wanted the best haunted house ever, he tasked his Imagineers to capture ghosts and put them inside of a mansion. When Disney wanted to build the city of tomorrow, he dredged 300 acres of swampland to make it happen. The Disney Company continued to go above and beyond for their guests after Walt passed on. They transported a western mountain into the heart of Hong Kong, put the African savanna in the middle of Florida, and dropped the canals of Venice in Tokyo. The Disney Company had access to real magic, and those that visited the residence of Lord Henry Mystic could see it firsthand. The challenge for the company was in getting the Chinese to visit the resorts in large numbers. They would become believers and pay for it if they could be made to feel that the experience was worth the value. When people set foot in Disneyland, they could tell that it was someplace special. The expressions on visitors changed as soon as they got past the front gate. It was because the park was something tangible. Other parks and park designers did a good job at creating a facade. They could create themed lands and fun rides too, but there was something missing. The other parks lacked depth. If people scratched the surface, they could see that the lands were two-dimensional mock-ups. They could see that an attraction was built inside of an empty building. A paint job, some stucco, and a few plants could make a warehouse look like a castle, or a mountain, or a boat. The illusion was easily broken. All of the Disney parks were different in this regard. The castles, mountains, and boats were built exclusively for the park. Best of all, these locations all told a story. Every land anchored a distinct place and time. Every building reinforced that era, and every attraction was an unforgettable moment. The closer a visitor looked at the park, the more they realized that it wasn't all smoke and mirrors. These were real, tangible places, and not flat props. When people interacted with the cast members, they could see that these people really enjoyed their jobs. They enjoyed being part of the era. Putting a smile on the faces of their guests was the goal. How would Shanghai Disneyland be a different experience than Hong Kong Disneyland? How would it be different from Tokyo, or Paris for that matter? The community had an idea of what to expect. Many attractions had been duplicated in several parks over the past few years. Instead of developing distinct rides and attractions, the Imagineers and vendors had learned to build 2 or even 3 versions of the same attraction that could be installed in several parks. This helped save time and money. As long as these rides were of high quality, most guests didn't seem to mind. The Chinese, however, were not eager to see a duplicate of the Hong Kong park. They wanted 2 distinct parks that offered different but equally memorable experiences. Some of the attractions in Shanghai would be similar to those in Hong Kong, but with new lands being developed as well. The layout, terrain, water features, transportation system, and hotels were all vastly different as well. The Chinese would be getting a second park that no other nation could claim. This bit of exclusivity would go over well with the people. We hope you have enjoyed this look at Disney in China. The Pink Monorail will now be adding permanent stops in China so that our guests can be updated to the latest happenings. Now please climb aboard and take your seats. The next line is departing. As always, you're welcome to ask questions or comments on anything you've heard in these past podcasts. A special shout out to our sponsor, Circa 1955. Nicole is the founder of Luxe Illume, a small company that makes candles, wax melts, and room sprays. She creates scents that capture the season, nature, or wonderful memories. She also does custom commissions for large orders, such as weddings or company gifts. Nicole is also a huge Disney fan, and she has a line called Circa 1955. She creates scents inspired by all things Disney. This includes the parks, attractions, treats, and films. Nicole creates each formula and batch of candles herself. For every one scent she's released, she's probably made over 200 trials just to get the smell right. Don't take my word for it. Go to circa1955.com, order a candle, and use promo code PINK15. That's PINK15 to get 15% off your purchase. Support a small company that also gives back to the community. You're going to love it. Another shout out to Jim Hill for hosting Pink Monorail on his podcast network. The Pink Monorail podcast features Shelley and Alice. My name is Noah, and I'm filling in for the China series. The Jim Hill podcast network also includes Looking at Lucasfilm with Dan Zer, The Disney Dish with Len Testa, I Want That with Shelley, Marvel Us Disney with Aaron Adams, and Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review for each podcast. We really appreciate it.